What is resetting on April 2nd is not merely a planetary ingress recorded in an astronomical ephemeris, not a distant celestial event that belongs to astronomers rather than to you. What is resetting is the collective field within which an entire civilization's imagination has been operating for the last 165 years, the shared frequency of what a generation has been capable of dreaming as real, and when that field changes, everything that was impossible to imagine inside the old frequency begins to become thinkable inside the new one. And whether you know, that is the difference between experiencing this transition and participating in it. The word reset implies a return, a restoration of a previous state, a return to zero. The Hermetic tradition that actually mapped these planetary cycles understood it differently. A cycle in the Hermetic sense does not return to its origin the way a clock returns to 12. It completes and transcends. What emerges at the threshold is not a copy of what existed before the cycle began. It is what became possible to dream as a result of everything the cycle dissolved, questioned, and rebuilt. And the field that opens on April 2nd carries within it the specific quality of the 165 years that preceded this moment. Collective dreams, collective illusions, the quality of imagination that an entire era shares without examining. The unspoken agreements about what a human being is, what civilization is, what is possible and what has never been questioned. These are the things Neptune governs, not in the personal, individual sense, but in the frequency that a generation breathes without knowing it is breathing. The deepest beliefs a culture carries are the ones it never decided to believe. It absorbed them the way it absorbs air. Neptune, in the tradition of mundane astrology, is the planet that moves through those beliefs like weather moves through a landscape, invisibly, inescapably, always. If this kind of deep cycle knowledge speaks to you, the kind that maps patterns larger than any single event, subscribe to this channel. This is where we track what actually shapes the field you are living inside, and what knowing that makes possible. Consider what happened in 2008. The financial crisis was not just a collapse of numbers, it was the moment when a collective belief revealed itself to millions of people simultaneously as something that had always been dreamed rather than discovered. The certainty that housing markets could only rise, that derivatives contain no systemic risk, that the institutions holding the money were stable. None of those were facts. They were dreams held collectively at such intensity that they became indistinguishable from reality. Neptune doesn't create those dreams. Neptune is the field within which they are held, and when Neptune changes, the quality of what can be collectively dreamed as real begins to change as well. Most people encountering the phrase Neptune enters Aries assume they are receiving information about something that will happen to them. An external event that will arrive the way weather arrives, shaping conditions they move through but don't control. The tradition that spent centuries mapping these transits understood it differently. A Neptune ingress of this magnitude does not happen to a civilization. It reveals the field the civilization has always been operating inside and simultaneously changes the quality of that field. You have always been inside it. What changes now is that the field itself is asking a different question. And the first movement of working with any Neptune transit is simply to recognize the question being asked. And here is the inversion that changes how this entire transit is understood. What Neptune dissolves is never what is real. It dissolves only what was held as real without ever having been examined. The structures, the collective narratives about identity and meaning that crumble under a Neptune transit. They don't crumble because they were attacked. They crumble because they were sustained by collective agreement rather than by actual substance. And the Neptune field removes the agreement while leaving the substance. What remains after a Neptune transit is not the ruins of what was. It is what was always there underneath the agreement. And in the case of Neptune in Aries, what remains will be the first honest answer to a question not asked in 165 years. In mundane astrology, the branch of the tradition concerned with collective rather than individual cycles, the outer planets are understood as governing not events, but fields. Uranus governs the field within which structural ruptures become possible. Pluto governs the field within which power is transformed at the root. Neptune governs the field within which a civilization's imagination operates, what it is capable of believing, what it considers real without examination. In The Outer Planets and Their Cycles, Liz Green documented the specific pattern that emerges whenever Neptune changes signs. Not a political event, but a transformation in the quality of what a generation is capable of dreaming. The dreaming field changes, and when the dreaming field changes, what becomes possible to imagine, and therefore to create, changes with it. Neptune takes its name from the Roman god of the sea. But in the tradition that mapped its cycles carefully, the sea was not simply a geographic feature. It was the symbol for the unconscious field that underlies all visible reality. The ocean you can see, the one ships cross and storms ravage, is the surface. What lies beneath is the vast, unmeasured, largely invisible terrain that shapes everything above it without being seen. This is what the Hermetic tradition recognized as Neptune's domain, not the surface events of collective history, but the invisible field of collectively held belief and imagination that generates those events. Neptune doesn't rule what happens. It rules the quality of dreaming that makes certain things possible to happen at all. If what we're mapping here is already landing for you as more than astrological theory, write in the comments right now. The new dream begins, not as a declaration of spiritual certainty, as an acknowledgement that the field has changed and that you recognize what that means. Here is what Neptune in the astrological tradition is not about: weather, the literal ocean, water signs, or fluidity as a general spiritual quality. Neptune governs something far more precise and far more unsettling: the mechanism by which a civilization comes to believe something is real, not through evidence, not through reasoning, but through saturation. The most powerful beliefs a culture carries are the ones it absorbed slowly, invisibly, ubiquitously, until the belief and the background of reality became indistinguishable. Neptune is the planet of that mechanism. Its transit through a sign reveals which beliefs operating in that sign's domain have reached the limit of what collective saturation can sustain, and it begins dissolving the ones that cannot survive examination. Neptune has been in Pisces since 2012. Pisces rules transcendence, dissolution of boundaries, universal connection, and the slow dismantling of structures that separate the individual from the collective. What Neptune in Pisces dissolved over the past 13 years was not arbitrary. It dismantled the rigid institutional frameworks through which people organized their spiritual lives, their sense of collective belonging, their belief in the solidity of the systems that govern them. The boundaries between nations, between identities, between established categories of meaning, all of these experienced sustained pressure under Neptune in Pisces. The result was not chaos for its own sake. It was preparation, the clearing of structures too rigid to make room for what comes next, which is the question Neptune in Aries begins to ask now. Think about the specific texture of attention you bring to content like this. Not entertainment attention, not distraction attention, but the quality of attention that feels like something is being confirmed rather than merely encountered. That quality of attention is not available to everyone who encounters a map of what this cycle means. It requires a specific orientation, a consciousness already in motion toward questions that this kind of mapping describes. The tradition would not call that coincidence. It would call it correspondence. As above, so below. The outer cycle and the inner readiness correspond. You are not encountering this information from outside the field it describes. You are inside the field, already moving in a direction the field is activating, and this map confirms the movement you have already begun. What you inherited as normal, what the culture around you decided was obvious, what nobody questioned because everyone agreed without discussing it, what the previous generation built and handed to you as permanent. The invisible architecture of collective belief that shapes which possibilities you can see and which ones remain invisible. These are the structures Neptune moves through like weather moves through a landscape, not explosively, not dramatically, but persistently, until the weather shifts, until the collective dream that sustained those structures reaches the point where sustaining it requires more energy than it generates. And then something shifts. The architecture reveals itself as something that was always dreamed, never discovered. Every Neptune transit through a sign produces two distinct experiences, depending on where a consciousness is oriented when the transit begins. Those oriented toward the structures Neptune is dissolving experience the transit as loss. The slow, inexplicable erosion of what felt solid, reliable and permanent. Those oriented toward what is forming in the wake of the dissolution experience it differently, as the gradual appearance of a quality of perception, imagination or understanding that was not available before. The same field, the same transit. The difference is entirely in the orientation a consciousness brings to what is happening. And orientation can be chosen even now, even at the threshold. If this content is opening something in you, take a second to like this video. That tells me this work is reaching the right people at the right moment. Neptune in Aries does not continue what Neptune in Pisces was doing. It interrupts it. Pisces dissolved. Aries asks what the dissolution was for. The question changes entirely. Neptune in Pisces asked, what if none of the structures you thought were solid actually are? What if the separate self is less separate than it appears? Those were the questions of the past 13 years. Neptune in Aries asks something completely different. An Aries question, a first identity question. Now that the boundaries have been examined and found permeable, who are you specifically? What do you actually stand for? What is the first honest impulse of your identity, stripped of everything inherited without choosing? The cycle doesn't repeat, it transcends, and the question it asks now is not a continuation of what came before. Aries in the Hermetic tradition is the first impulse, not in the sense of the first month of the calendar, but in the sense of the first movement of consciousness toward individuated existence. Before any form takes shape, before any structure is built, before any identity is named, there is the raw impulse of being, the moment consciousness says, I exist, distinct, here, now. This is the Aries archetype. At the personal level, it governs raw beginnings, first initiative, identity before experience has shaped it. At the collective level, it governs what a civilization understands as the most fundamental answer to who are we? Not the elaborate, constructed answer of institutions and traditions, but the first honest impulse before any elaboration begins. Consider the specific moment when a child learns the word I, the discovery that it is not simply the universe, but a distinct center with its own perspective, its own position. Developmental theory describes this as one of the most significant thresholds in human development. Now scale that moment to a civilization learning or relearning or re-examining what it means when it says we. Who counts? What is shared? What is the actual core of collective identity? That is the Aries question at civilizational scale. And Neptune in Aries asks it against the background of Neptune's dissolving field, the unveiling of which we was always real beneath the ones that were merely assumed and never questioned. What happens when Neptune's dissolving field meets Aries' first identity impulse is a civilizational redreaming of the most fundamental question. Who are we? not as nations, not as religious groupings, not as economic classes, but as a species, as consciousness inhabiting form. The collective beliefs about what a human being actually is, what it is capable of, what defines it. These come under the Neptune field at its most specific level. The definitions that sustained a collective identity dissolve slowly, persistently, and simultaneously Aries begins demanding a new answer, not gradually, now. The Aries archetype does not wait for the field to settle before initiating. The question is asked, the old answer begins to fail, and the field holds itself open for what is dreamed in the space that opens. Who counts as a person? What is the self beyond the body? What is a civilization supposed to be? What does it mean to belong to something that extends beyond the nation, the tradition, the institutional category? These are not philosophical questions when asked inside a Neptune in Aries field. They are the lived texture of what a generation navigates. The questions arrive not through academic inquiry, but through the lived experience of watching the previous answers fail to hold what they promised to hold. And when a civilization is inside that lived texture, two things become simultaneously possible: the deepest form of disorientation and the most creative moment of collective identity formation that a generation can experience. If you have been sensing that the frameworks you've been working with, the systems, the practices, the understandings of who you are and what you're building, are shifting in a way that's difficult to name, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to work with the field consciously, rather than be moved by it without orientation. There is a misread of the Aries archetype that matters here. Aries is not the archetype of aggression. It is the archetype of the undeniable. The distinction is significant. Aggression is a behavior. The undeniable is a quality of truth that exists whether or not it is acted upon aggressively. What Neptune in Aries dissolves is not the capacity for conflict. It dissolves the capacity to sustain a definition of identity that cannot withstand direct examination. What Aries contributes to the Neptune field is not the fire of attack. It is the fire of the first honest moment, the point where the pretense about who we are fails, because the actual identity underneath can no longer be suppressed, regardless of what structures were built on top of it. The pattern that emerges across the historical windows when Neptune has been in Aries is not political in its primary character. The political events are the surface. The pattern at the deeper level is always the same. The collective question of who counts, who belongs, and what a human being actually is reaches a threshold of pressure that existing definitions cannot contain. And under that pressure, new movements begin forming. Movements organized not around traditional categories of identity, but around a different answer to the question of what a human being fundamentally is. This has happened before. It is recognizable, and the map of what it produces is available because the last generation to live inside this field left records. The 1861-1875 Neptune in Aries window is almost always discussed through the lens of the American Civil War. But if you examine what was happening in the collective dream field during those years, the war is only the surface of a much larger pattern of identity reorganization. Under that same sky, a wave of spiritual and philosophical inquiry was building that had nothing to do with military conflict. It was the period of the American spiritualism movement, the first mass popular questioning in the Western world of whether human identity ends at the physical boundary of the body. Millions of people, at roughly the same time, began asking, is there more to what we are than the physical form? That question, and not the war, was the Neptune in Aries event of that era. In November 1875, As Neptune was completing its transit through Aries, Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott founded the Theosophical Society in New York City. The timing was not accidental. Blavatsky had spent the entire Neptune in Aries period, from the 1860s through the mid-1870s, traveling, studying, investigating traditions from Egypt to India to Tibet, attempting to articulate an answer the existing Western frameworks could not provide. What is a human being, beyond the categories that science and institutional religion both offered? The Theosophical Society was the articulation of a new collective dream about human identity. That consciousness is not limited by a single lifetime, tradition, or civilization. That dream could not have been formed before the Neptune in Aries field dissolved what the previous consensus had made unthinkable. The spiritualism movement that swept through American and European culture in the mid to late 19th century is often treated as a historical curiosity, a period when seances and mediums were fashionable before science dismissed the phenomenon. But through the lens of Neptune in Aries, what the spiritualism movement represents is something more structurally significant. It was the first large-scale collective experiment in a new definition of human identity. The question it was exploring, is human consciousness limited to the physical body and a single lifetime, or does it extend beyond those boundaries? Is precisely the kind of question that Neptune in Aries generates. It dissolves the inherited definition and creates the space for a new collective dream about who and what we are at the most fundamental level. Universal brotherhood as the foundation of a new civilization. Human consciousness as something that extends across multiple lives rather than terminating at physical death. The great spiritual traditions of humanity, East and West, ancient and modern, as variations on a single understanding rather than competing contradictions. A human being as something fundamentally larger than the 19th century categories allowed for. These were the specific components of the new collective dream that Neptune in Aries produced in its most articulate form. Not a religion, a redreaming of what a human being actually is, and therefore what a human civilization could become. And the fact that those ideas arrived precisely when Neptune was moving through Aries is not a coincidence that the tradition would allow to go unremarked. Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, 2 years before Neptune entered Aries. But the full civilizational disruption of Darwin's work entered the collective field during Neptune in Aries, not before. Not the scientific theory, the identity question the theory forced. If human beings were continuous with rather than categorically separate from the rest of life, then who exactly was a human being? What was the nature of human identity if the inherited definition no longer held? Neptune in Aries made that question live in the collective consciousness in a way that scientific publication alone could not have produced. The question was already there in the field before the book appeared. Neptune in Aries gave the collective the inability to look away from it. The Civil War has been described as political, economic, moral. From the perspective of Neptune in Aries, it was something more specific. It was what happened when a civilization's collective dream about identity, who counts as a full person, who has the right to self-determination, who is included in the we of the Republic, could no longer hold under the pressure of Neptune's dissolving field. Slavery was not a new problem in 1861. What was new was that the old dream about who was and was not a person had reached the threshold where sustaining it required more collective energy than the field could produce. Neptune in Aries did not cause the war. It made the old definition impossible to maintain. And the violence was what happened in the gap between the definition failing and the new one forming. Every Neptune in Aries window produces two simultaneous streams of response to the collective identity question. The first stream responds to the dissolving of old definitions by creating new ones that are equally rigid and equally exclusive. We are this specifically, and the boundary around us is what defines us against everyone outside. This stream produces nationalism, fundamentalism, and the aggressive reassertion of identity categories precisely as the old ones begin to fail. The second stream responds by expanding the definition. Who we are is larger than any category we previously used to contain it. Both streams draw from the same Neptune in Aries field. The field doesn't determine which stream a culture chooses, but it creates the pressure that makes the choice unavoidable. And both streams are visible simultaneously in 2025. By the time Neptune left Aries in 1875-1876, the movements that would shape the next half-century were either established or seeded. The Theosophical Society had begun its first global network of people exchanging ideas about universal human identity. The early suffrage organizations had begun the long work of expanding the legal definition of who counted as a full citizen. The abolitionist victory had forced the first constitutional acknowledgement that the old definition of personhood was untenable. None of these were complete. All were beginnings, the specific kind of beginning that a Neptune in Aries transit generates, a new collective dream about who counts as a full human being, articulated clearly enough to become the seeds of the structures that followed over the next 80 years. What the Theosophical Society proposed as a new collective dream about human identity was radical, in a way difficult to appreciate from contemporary distance. In 1875, the dominant Western frameworks understood human identity as bounded, singular, and defined by the civilization you were born into. The theosophical teaching, drawing from Hindu, Buddhist, Egyptian, and Hermetic sources simultaneously, proposed that a human being is a consciousness that travels across multiple lifetimes, belongs to no single tradition, and participates in a universal brotherhood that transcends national, racial, and religious categories. Whether you assess that as literally true or as useful metaphor, it was the first systematic attempt in the modern West to articulate a definition of human identity that the structures Neptune in Aries was dissolving had made unthinkable. The first of the 7 Hermetic principles in the Kybalion is most directly relevant here, the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. Applied to the collective field, this principle describes exactly what Neptune in Aries operates on. If reality, as it appears to human consciousness, is a product of that consciousness, then what a civilization collectively believes and imagines becomes the architecture of what that civilization can produce. The collective dream is not a side effect of the civilization. It is the substrate, the field within which events, politics, and individual choices take their shape. Neptune in Aries works at the level of that substrate. This is why the Hermetic tradition treated these transits as among the most significant windows in the entire astrological cycle, because they shift the dream that generates everything else. Here is what the popular narrative about Neptune entering Aries is consistently missing. The contrast between Neptune in Pisces and Neptune in Aries is not a contrast between softness and aggression. It is a contrast between two completely different questions. Neptune in Pisces asked, what if the boundaries you thought were solid aren't? What if the separate self is less separate than it appears? Those were the questions of the past 13 years. Neptune in Aries asks something entirely different. An Aries question, a first identity question. Now that the boundaries have been examined, who are you specifically? What do you actually stand for? What is the first honest impulse of your identity, stripped of everything inherited without choosing? The cycle doesn't repeat, it transcends, and the question it asks now is not a continuation of what came before. Artificial intelligence asking humanity what consciousness actually is. The collapse of institutional religion forcing millions to ask what spirituality looks like without an institution. Climate change forcing a civilizational reckoning with what collective responsibility actually means. The question of who counts as a full person, citizen, worker, body, consciousness, pressed from multiple directions simultaneously. These are not separate crises. They are the same Neptune in Aries question, arriving through different surfaces at the same time. The question in every case is the same. Who are we, actually? Not who were we told we are. Not who did the institutions define us as. What is the honest, examined answer to what a human being is in 2025? And what is a civilization that honors that answer supposed to look like? Consider the specific quality of attention you bring to a video like this one. Not entertainment attention, not distraction attention, but the quality that feels like something is being confirmed rather than merely encountered. That quality of attention is not available to everyone who watches content about Neptune in Aries. It requires a specific orientation, a consciousness already in motion toward questions that this kind of mapping describes. The tradition would not call that coincidence. It would call it correspondence. As above, so below. You are not encountering this information from outside the field it describes. You are inside the field, moving in a direction the field is activating. And this map confirms the movement that has already begun in you before you found it. And here is what the dissolution that Neptune in Aries activates does not threaten. What is real in you. Neptune's dissolving field only dissolves what was sustained by collective agreement rather than actual substance. The aspects of your identity that are grounded in direct experience, genuine examination, actual knowledge, these are not threatened by Neptune's field. They are revealed more clearly as the surrounding material dissolves. What is threatened is only what was never fully true. The inherited assumptions, the absorbed definitions, the unexamined agreements about who you are that you never chose to carry. And losing those is not a loss. It is what the tradition would call a clarification. The question Neptune in Aries is asking is not how much you will lose. It is how clearly you can see what was always real when the rest falls away. Neptune in Aries operates simultaneously at 3 levels of identity. The first is personal, the story of who you are as an individual, the self-definition that shapes what you consider possible for yourself. The second is collective, the story of what your community, nation, or civilization is, who belongs, what it stands for, what its role in the human story is. The third is spiritual, the question of what a human being is at its most fundamental level, not psychological, not social, but ontological. What is the nature of human consciousness? What is the self beyond its inherited description? All 3 levels come under the Neptune in Aries field simultaneously because all 3 are aspects of the same question. The transit works at the root of identity, before the branches and the leaves, at the level where the root was always planted. The Corpus Hermeticum, the Greco-Egyptian texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, translated by Marsilio Ficino in the Renaissance, and foundational to the Western esoteric tradition, contains, in several of its dialogues, a description of what happens when collective consciousness reaches a threshold. In the Poimandre and the Asclepius, there is a recurring idea. Moments come in the arc of civilization when the nous, the universal mind, creates an opening for a new quality of consciousness to emerge. These moments are not random. They correspond to configurations that the tradition mapped carefully over centuries. Neptune in Aries in the Hermetic framework represents one of those openings, a moment when the nous creates space for a new collective understanding of what human consciousness actually is. Not by force, by the removal of what was obscuring the understanding that was always there. The Hermetic tradition distinguishes between two categories of question a consciousness can ask about itself, and the distinction matters especially here. The first is the manifestation question: what do I want? What do I intend to create? This question operates inside an existing identity structure. It assumes you know who you are and uses that identity as the foundation for producing outcomes. The second is the examination question: what am I? Who is the one who wants? This question operates at the threshold of identity rather than inside it. Neptune in Aries creates a field where the examination question has more power than it has had in 165 years. The tradition would say that is not an accident. It is the precise moment when the field most rewards the consciousness willing to ask who it is, rather than only what it wants. Two responses to the Neptune in Aries field are available simultaneously. The first is to move through it without recognizing it, to experience shifts in collective identity as external events happening around you, to feel pressure on old definitions without understanding the source, to absorb the expanding range of imagination without knowing why it is expanding. This response is not wrong. It is simply oriented toward effects rather than source. The second response is to enter the field consciously, to recognize what cycle you're inside, to know what it is dissolving and why, to engage the examination question deliberately. The Hermetic tradition did not claim that conscious participation changes what happens. It made a different claim, that conscious participation changes the quality of what you are able to use from what happens. Experiencing a cycle without knowing what it is, absorbing its effects without being able to locate their source, moving through the field the way weather moves through a landscape, shaped by it, unable to distinguish what is the field and what is personal. This is one way to inhabit a Neptune transit, or knowing where you are, knowing what the field is asking, knowing what the dissolution is preparing the space for. Being able to distinguish between the loss of what was never fully real and the loss of what was genuinely valuable. Being able to ask the examination question precisely rather than in generalized confusion. The difference between those two experiences is not in the field. The field is identical for both. The difference is in the map and in whether you found it before the threshold opened. The mystery schools of the ancient world, the Pythagorean traditions, the Egyptian initiatory lineages, the Neoplatonic schools of Alexandria, preserved a specific concept of readiness that differs from the modern usage. In contemporary language, ready means prepared, having the skills, knowledge, or resources to act. In the mystery school tradition, readiness at a threshold was something different. The willingness to let the question be asked without immediately defending the existing answer. An initiate was considered ready not when they had a plan for what they would become, but when they had developed the capacity to tolerate genuine uncertainty about who they were, while remaining stable enough to engage that uncertainty productively. Tolerance for the open question was the initiatic qualification, not knowledge, not certainty. The ability to remain present to a question whose answer had not yet arrived. The first practice the Hermetic tradition associated with identity threshold periods is called recognition. Not meditation in the contemplative sense, not manifestation in the projective sense, but a specific practice of direct examination. The practice is this: what definition of who you are you currently carrying that you never consciously chose? Not the definitions you examined and affirmed, not the ones you arrived at through direct experience, the ones you absorbed from culture, family, institutional structures, the collective dream of the era you were born into. Those absorbed definitions are what Neptune in Aries specifically targets. Recognition asks you to name them, not to immediately replace them, but to see them clearly enough to assess which ones you would actually choose. now if choosing were the option available. The Neptune in Aries field makes that option available. In the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, carved into the stone, were 3 phrases. The most famous was Gnothi Siauten, know thyself. It has been treated as general philosophical advice, an encouragement toward self-reflection. But in its original context, as an inscription at the threshold of the ancient Greek world's most significant oracle, it was not advice. It was an operational instruction. The oracle at Delphi did not primarily answer questions about the future. It answered questions about the nature of the one asking. Before the oracle could respond, the questioner was required to address what they were. The Know Thyself inscription was the first instruction at the threshold, before inquiry began. Examine what you are before asking what will become of you. That instruction is the recognition practice in its earliest known articulation. Here is what most people do when identity definitions begin to dissolve under a Neptune transit. They work harder to maintain them. The dissolution feels threatening, so the response is to assert the definition more firmly, to hold the existing story with more grip, to find more evidence for the version of themselves already constructed. The Hermetic tradition describes this as working against the field rather than with it, expending energy to sustain precisely what the field is designed to clarify through dissolution. The identification held with the most desperate grip during a Neptune transit is almost always the one most in need of examination. The willingness to loosen the grip, not to abandon the identity, but to examine it rather than defend it, is the operative skill the mystery schools developed specifically for threshold periods like this one. The specific question Neptune in Aries forces at the level of spiritual identity is one that Neptune in Pisces, paradoxically, made more difficult to ask clearly. Neptune in Pisces dissolved the institutional containers of spiritual practice, the credibility of organized religion as reliable mediator between a human being and what they considered sacred. That dissolution was real, but it left many people in a spiritual landscape without structure, aware that the old institutions were insufficient, without a clear alternative. Neptune in Aries asks the question the dissolution was preparing the ground for. Without the institutional structure, what is your direct relationship with what you consider sacred? Not the tradition, not the framework inherited from someone else. The actual living relationship, which is precisely the Aries question, the first identity question, asked before any institution was built to manage it. Not the inherited form, not the theology someone else developed and you absorbed, not the ritual designed for a civilization whose questions were different from yours, not the institutional category that defines spirituality in terms of membership and observance. The living relationship, the direct contact, the first impulse experience of what you actually know about what you consider sacred, before the elaboration, before the structure, before the tradition processed it into a form that could be transmitted and administered. Aries governs the first impulse before the form. Neptune in Aries dissolves the forms that have drifted away from the impulse they were originally built to express. And what it reveals underneath those forms is the impulse itself, which is always more alive, more specific, and more demanding than any structure built to contain it. The second practice that becomes specifically potent during a Neptune in Aries transit is intentional dreaming, a practice deliberately different from manifestation and from standard contemplative meditation. The practice works as follows. In the hypnagogic state immediately before sleep, the threshold between waking consciousness and the dream field, you direct attention to a specific question, not about what you want or intend to create, but about what you are. The question, "What am I?" posed at the threshold of the dream state, engages the Neptune field at its most accessible point. Aries contributes the quality of first impulse, not the elaborate constructed self, but the root identity that precedes elaboration. The Neptune in Aries field responds to that question with a quality of answer that the waking, defended, structured mind cannot access through deliberate reasoning alone. The Egyptian mystery schools at Memphis and Abydos practiced a form of threshold state inquiry that modern sleep research would recognize as hypnagogic induction. Initiates were trained to maintain awareness at the threshold between waking and sleep, not to fall asleep, not to meditate awake, but to hold the specific quality of consciousness available in that transitional state. The practices were not arbitrary. They were designed for periods of particular collective significance, and records preserved in later Neoplatonic writings suggest that threshold state practices were intensified during periods when the celestial mechanics indicated an identity threshold quality in the collective field. The hypnagogic state was understood as the point where the constructed self becomes most transparent and the underlying pattern most legible. It was, practically, the most direct access to the kind of identity-level information a Neptune in Aries field makes available. And here is the inversion that makes the intentional dreaming practice work differently than expected. It is not about the consistency of the practice. It is about the quality of the question. The Hermetic tradition taught consistently that the field responds to the depth of inquiry rather than its frequency. An intentional dreaming practice asking, "What do I want my life to look like?" will receive answers from within the existing identity structure, useful answers, but not ones that engage the Neptune in Aries field at the level it operates. A practice asking, "What am I actually beneath the story I've been carrying?" opens different access. The question reaches further than the constructed mind can reach in waking life. And the Neptune in Aries field, as of April 2nd, is prepared to meet a question of that depth with more than the field could offer before the transit began. Inside the Neptune in Aries field, two types of dreaming occur simultaneously across the population. The first is reactive. The dream life processes what the waking life is losing. Collapsed structures, failed definitions, identities that cannot hold under the pressure of the field. This dreaming is necessary and real, and it happens automatically without intention. The second type is active. The dream life becomes a site of identity exploration, the emergence of what is forming, not only the processing of what is dissolving. Active dreaming does not happen automatically. It requires the orientation that intentional practice creates, the willingness to bring a genuine question into the threshold state, and to receive without defensiveness what the field offers in response. Reactive dreaming is what the cycle gives you. Active dreaming is what you bring to the cycle. The third practice is one the Aries archetype makes specifically important in a way Neptune in Pisces did not require: articulation. Aries governs the voice of first impulse, the declaration of existence, the statement of identity before it has been elaborated into structure. Neptune in Aries creates a demand for articulation that was absent from the Pisces dissolution field. Pisces rewarded release of form, embrace of fluidity, comfort with not knowing. Aries rewards the first naming, the willingness to put into language, however imperfect, what the examination and intentional dreaming have begun to reveal. Not a public declaration, not a manifesto to share, a private articulation, the first words of the next version of your identity, written in a space where no external judgment reaches them while they are still forming. What happens when a new identity is articulated in writing, even privately, is described in both the Hermetic tradition and in contemporary narrative psychology. The Hermetic principle at work is the principle of correspondence. Articulation at the level of language creates a correspondence between the forming internal identity and the external field. In narrative psychology, the equivalent phenomenon is what researchers call narrative identity. The self is partly constituted by the story it tells about itself, and changing the story, even in a private journal, begins to change the structure of the self. Both frameworks point to the same mechanism. Language creates coherence, coherence creates capacity, and capacity creates correspondence with the field. The articulation is not only describing a new identity. Under Neptune in Aries, it is participating in dreaming it into coherence. Not a declaration for the world, not an announcement to make before you know if it's ready, not a public performance of a new identity you haven't yet inhabited. A private articulation, written in the space between dissolution and construction, written when the words are still uncertain and the identity is still forming, written not to declare what you are, but to begin discovering what you are by the act of attempting to name it. The Hermetic tradition knew that language and identity co-create each other. The Egyptian scribes who maintained the sacred texts understood that the written word carried a quality of being, a specificity of form that silent thought alone could not produce. Under Neptune in Aries, the act of writing I am, even without certainty about what follows, participates in the dreaming field. The historical example that illuminates this practice most directly is Blavatsky before the Theosophical Society existed. Years before 1875, before any public articulation of what she would bring into the world, Blavatsky was writing in private journals about a version of human spiritual identity that no institution of her time was describing. The articulation preceded the movement by years. The private naming of what she understood human consciousness to be, cosmic in scope, multi-traditional in its sources, extended across lifetimes, was not a record of a fully formed vision. It was the practice through which the vision formed. The writing did not describe the Theosophical Society in advance. The writing participated in producing it. Private articulation under Neptune in Aries is how the collective dreams of the next era begin to form, through specific individual voices, writing in the space between dissolution and construction. What the Blavatsky example demonstrates is a pattern that repeats across Neptune in Aries transitions. Individual private articulation at the threshold seeds the collective movements that define the era. The leaders who shaped the post-Civil War world had been articulating their understanding of human identity in private, in letters, in small networks, for years before the public moment arrived that made those articulations structurally consequential. The suffragette organizers of the early 19th century were writing and meeting in private networks long before public institutions could receive what they were articulating. The collective dream of the next era does not arrive publicly first. It arrives in private, in the specific individuals working consciously with the field at the threshold. And then, as the transit develops, those private articulations find each other, recognize each other, and become something that can be organized publicly. Here is the inversion that resolves the most common form of paralysis at a threshold like this one. You do not need to know what the new dream looks like in order to begin dreaming it. The assumption that you must have clarity about the destination before taking the first step belongs to transitions where the path is already mapped. A Neptune in Aries threshold is not that kind of transition. The recognition practice, the intentional dreaming, the private articulation, none of these require you to have arrived at a clear vision of who you are becoming. All three require only that you be genuinely present to the question. The clarity arrives through the practices, not before them. The dream takes form through the dreaming, not as a precondition for it. The field opens before the vision forms. That is the correct order. The phrase, "this year only" in this title, refers to something specific. 2025-2026 is the opening phase of the Neptune in Aries transit, when the field is at its most generative, most raw, most open to the identity seeding that defines the character of the entire era to follow. Neptune will remain in Aries until approximately 2038-2039, a 14-year transit. But the first year carries a quality that cannot be replicated later. The field is establishing itself for the first time. The first collective and individual responses to the new identity question are forming, and what is planted consciously in this opening phase grows through the entire transit. What enters later arrives into a field already partially organized by the early seedings. The opening window is the most generative. It is also the briefest. It is what April 2nd marks. What was planted in the first years of the 1861-1875 transit determined the shape of the entire era that followed. The early abolitionist organizing of 1861-1863, the first spiritualist publications of the early 1860s, the private conversations and networks that would eventually become the Theosophical Society, all were planted in the opening phase before the field was organized enough for larger structures to form. By 1875, when Neptune left Aries, those early seeds had already become the structures shaping the following era. The movements that defined the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the first wave of feminism, the legal expansion of personhood, the global networks of esoteric inquiry, had their roots in seeds planted in years 1 through 3 of the transit. The opening window is not the whole story, but it is where the whole story begins. The difference between navigating this transit with a map and without one is not a difference in what happens. The field changes regardless. The old identity definitions come under pressure regardless. The new identity question is asked regardless. The difference is in the quality of participation, the degree to which a consciousness can use what the field is offering, rather than being simply moved by it without comprehension. The Hermetic tradition preserved these maps not to make initiates immune to the cycles, but to give them vocabulary and practices for engaging consciously with what the cycles activate. That engagement is available to anyone who finds the map before the transit is advanced enough for the field to have organized around the early responses. This is why the opening window matters, not because it changes what the cycle does, but because it changes what you can do with it. Consider the specific timing of this moment. The transit begins April 2nd. You are at this content in the days surrounding that threshold. The majority of the population will not encounter a map of the Neptune in Aries field in the opening days of the transit. They will find it later, after the field has organized around the first responses. You are at the threshold before it has fully settled. The law of correspondence would describe this timing not as luck, but as resonance. You were already moving in the direction the field is activating, or you would not have found this content at this specific moment. The map is a confirmation of a movement already underway in you, not an introduction to territory you haven't entered. Something brought you here before April 2nd, that something is not accidental. April the 2nd. The field opens. What can be imagined as real as possible, as within the range of what a human being is and can become, begins to expand in a direction it has not expanded since 1861. The question you couldn't quite formulate, the identity you couldn't quite name, the version of yourself that arrived at the edges of what the previous field allowed and then retreated, all of that finds new space under Neptune in Aries. Not immediately, not dramatically. As the weather changes, slowly, persistently, the way Neptune always moves. But the field has changed. The direction of the dreaming has changed, and what becomes possible to imagine and therefore to build is something this generation has not had available to it before this specific threshold. The question in the title, "Are you ready?" is not what it appears to be. Ready in ordinary usage means prepared. You have what you need. You have a plan. That kind of readiness is not what the Neptune in Aries field is asking for. The readiness the field requires is simpler and more demanding simultaneously. Can you let the question be asked? Can you be present to who are you actually beneath the inherited story? Without immediately defending the story, can you inhabit that question, sit inside it rather than immediately reaching for the nearest available answer? That willingness, which the mystery schools would have called the initiatic qualification for a threshold crossing, is what makes the difference between experiencing this transit passively and participating in it consciously. What the Hermetic tradition says about identity emerging from a consciously navigated Neptune transit is specific. It does not promise a stronger identity, not a more certain one or a more comfortable one. It promises a more honest one, from which the inherited assumptions have been examined enough that what remains is actually what you would choose if choosing were the option. That distinction matters. The identity that survives a consciously navigated Neptune in Aries transit has a quality of coherence that unexamined identities do not have, not because it is better in an absolute sense, but because it is more genuinely itself. What was always real has become more visible. What was never quite true has dissolved enough to stop obscuring it. That is what the 165-year cycle offers, not a guarantee, a clarification. Two possibilities are available to every consciousness in the Neptune in Aries window. The first, move through it as most people move through any cycle of change, absorbing the effects, responding to the pressure, managing what dissolves without understanding why, attempting to rebuild the same identity in a slightly different form as each dissolution completes. This is the default. It is what the cycle produces in the absence of orientation. The second, engage the field with the three practices: examination, intentional dreaming, articulation. Work with what Neptune in Aries is activating rather than simply experiencing its effects. The tradition would not claim the second path is more comfortable. It would claim it produces something the first cannot, a genuine encounter with what you actually are, beneath everything you were given to believe about yourself. What the 165-year cycle asks is not whether you have a plan. It does not ask if you are psychologically ready, spiritually prepared, or practically organized for what comes next. It asks something more fundamental and more honest than any of those questions. Can you stop pretending you already know who you are? Can you hold the actual question, not as a crisis, not as a problem to solve, but as an opening into something the previous field could not have offered? The willingness to inhabit that opening, to stay in the space between the dissolution of the old identity and the formation of the new one without collapsing either toward frantic reconstruction or toward paralysis, is the specific kind of readiness the mystery schools cultivated. And it is the readiness that April 2nd is asking for. Something is dissolving. Something is dreaming. Something in the collective imagination is reaching a threshold it has not reached since the generation of Lincoln and Blavatsky, of Darwin and Douglas, the generation that discovered that the inherited definitions of who counted as a person, what consciousness was, and what a human civilization was supposed to be, were all insufficient to contain what was actually true. That generation did not know in 1861 what the era would produce. They knew that the old answer had failed. They knew the new question had arrived. And the ones who engaged that question honestly, in private, in their writing, in their practices, in their small networks, became the seeds of everything that defined the era that followed. That process is beginning again. You are inside its opening moment. The 165-year cycle is not waiting for your preparation. It has not paused for this video to finish, for the examination practice to complete, for the private articulation to reach clarity. The reset is already happening. Neptune is already moving into Aries. The field is already changing. The collective dream of the previous era is already beginning the dissolution that the next 14 years will complete. What this moment asks is not for you to prepare before the event. The event is the context you are already inside. What it asks is whether you recognize that context clearly enough to engage it with the quality of intention that transforms experience into participation. And whether you are willing, in this opening window, to begin the dreaming that becomes part of what the next generation inherits as their collective imagination. If you stayed until the end of this video, write in the comments, "I receive the new dream," not as aspiration, as a recognition that the field is open, that you found this at this specific threshold, and that the quality of your dreaming changes when you know what cycle you are inside. I've placed another video on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.